President Dr. Sam Amadi is the policy strategist, law and governance expert. He is the director of the Abuja School of Social and Political Thought and a visiting professor at the Emerald Energy Institute at the University of Port Harcourt. He holds a research doctorate degree in law from the Harvard University, Cambridge, and Massachusetts, 2004. He also has a Master's of Public Administrations and a Master's in Law from the same institution. He was called to the Nigerian Bar in 1993 after passing from the Nigerian Law School. He was an associate professor and head of the Department of International Law and Jurisprudence at the Base University and Jurisprudence. He was also a visiting research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies from 2016 to 2018. Between the years 2010 and 2015, Professor Amadi was the chairman and chief executive officer of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. That is the regulatory body for electricity generation, distribution and transmission in Nigeria. He was a fellow of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. He's an author who has written so many books and articles in both local and leading international journals. At the moment, he coordinates the Abuja School of Social and Political Thought and the Chief Ideas Officer of the Logosphere Advisory, a public sector policy and strategy consulting firm in Abuja, Nigeria. Professor Amadi has spoken at national and international conferences, seminars, and training programs on different subject matters on policy and governance. And that is the man we have the honor of having this afternoon to lead us in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Please, another round of applause for him. As he makes his way here, please can we invite the participants that are sitting at the rear to please occupy the front seats. You can come forward, please. Thank you very much. Professor Sam Amadi, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Chairman, distinguished honorable members across West African countries. Let me apologize that I wasn't here earlier. I just came in from Benin, Enugu, eastern part of this country. I had to go through a lot to be here. I had to change tickets. I won't enter the plane. The plane had to return back because of aircraft problem. Midway in the flight, they got to return back to Enugu to wait to get it done, and then I was flown back, so that's why I just came, and I would have been here earlier, but I made sure I have to be here no matter what. I have a slide, I think it's on, next slide, and the controller should follow me as I go, okay. Yes, next slide. Who's running it? Okay. So I wanted to, of course, these are elementary, and all of you know everything here, but I'd like to clarify a few things. Next slide. Like I argue, the parliament, or any parliament, whether in West Africa or elsewhere, can best intervene in public debt management or public finance management by understanding the issues that define public debt and development. I like to see this as interconnected. Oftentimes, the mistake is to assume that public debt is just about debts or about money. It's actually about concept of development, so that's important. And so the solution to what is becoming apparent public finance crisis in West Africa and even Africa and across the world requires understanding of how public finance connects to economic development, and that's what I want to show. Next slide. Okay. So public debt is like a Janus-faced idea. It's good, it's bad. It has benefits, it can be a scourge. In the 1960s, development theorists were looking at how Africa can converge with the developed Indo-European groups, Europeans and Asians. The idea then was what we call capital accumulation. And the notion is that it's like a vicious circle. You are poor, so you have less capacity for savings, you have less capacity to form capital, to invest in social and physical infrastructure, and therefore the idea of either you have bridged that gap through public debts or through international development assistance. Somehow, public debt became a very important aspect of economic and social development because of the poverty and the lack of capital formation. Even in developed countries in Europe, most of the Suez Canal, most of the big projects that aided transformation were all through public debt, sometimes from private persons, sometimes non-profits with government charter borrowed money. So the notion here is that it's a blessing, but it's also a scourge. It could undermine sovereignty. It could constitute a drag on domestic expenditure because you are using much of your revenue to service debt. So that's why that concept is there. Next slide, yes. Now, the lens I like to use is a lens of economic development. And so oftentimes we've had people talk about debt is not a bad idea, and true, they're right. Debt might not be a bad idea. And everybody says we are financing infrastructure. But the notion is that it's difficult to say whether what we're financing actually leads to development. And so we must have a grip on development itself. What is development? And so we've moved on from GDP growth in the 1970s. West African countries, some of them recorded huge GDP growth. These days, we're having much more leaner and often stagnant GDP growth. And then today we're talking beyond GDP. We're talking about the notion of human capability, human functioning, social welfare, human development index, and then the idea of development as freedom. Now, I quoted Stiglitz because oftentimes when we talk about economic development, we don't see it not just about products, it's about transformation in social structure, in human capability, in the way we are getting people who are much more capable of innovation. People can create their own world. So social transformation for me is at the heart, and that's what the Nobel laureate Stiglitz says. Next slide, yeah. Okay, so the key point there is that we should see development as strategy aimed at transforming society and removing barriers. One of those barriers is illiteracy, poor health, so that people can have a much more fruitful life. Then in the 1965 or thereabout, a professor at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, Dudley Sear, summarized for us 3 lenses we can look at development. He says, if a country has rising poverty, rising inequality, rising unemployment, it's not developing. It doesn't matter whether the GDP figures show development. So if you use these 3 lenses, rising poverty, is the poverty going down or rising? 2, is unemployment going up or down? 3, is inequality expanding or contracting? He said that is the measure of development. So when we look at public finance management and we want to use public finance to catalyze development, the question there will now be, what will drive down unemployment, drive down poverty, and drive down inequality? And that's the test. Next slide. Okay. So still on what is development, I quoted Michael Todoro and Stephen Smith, and the whole idea is simple, that development must aim at increasing the availability and widening the distribution of basic life-supporting goods, including income, jobs, education, healthcare, 2, to raise level of living, and 3, to increase the range of economic and social choices available to people. So Nigeria is a resource-rich country, so we want to say whether Nigeria is rich or not in reality. These are some of the considerations we have to bear in mind. Next slide. Okay, so this is a bit of economic theory, but I won't waste much time so I get to where it matters. But I like to put the perspective well. So what I try to show in this slide is that thinking about economic development has taken many stages. The first stage was the stage of capital accumulation, looking at how much is happening to GDP capital. We move to second stage when we talk about human capital, not just physical capital. Are we raising human beings? So today, many of you parliamentarians go through the Human Development Index of your country. That is where we are now. We're looking at both healthcare, education as measure of economic development. The third generation says the difference between developed and underdeveloped countries is actually institutions. What kind of institutions do they have? That is why the West African ADB, I used to consult and speak at their events. They are now doing a lot on public finance management structure, trying to create institutions that enable growth, that improve the management of public finance. It's all in line with the thinking around the third generation. Next slide. Okay, so for Nigeria, we run a constitutional democracy, and all the African countries here, West African countries here, are all constitutional democracies. The patterns, the constitutions are the same. But there's something that we have in the Nigerian constitution, which they call the fundamental objectives and directive principle of state policy, chapter 2. Interestingly, this chapter of the constitution is said to be unenforceable, meaning you can't go to court and ask a judge to enforce it. But section 13 says that these principles should apply to every public official. So you have a problem. You can't go to court to get remedy, but the public officials ought to apply it. Now, what is important about this? This section was taken from the Indian constitutional section, and it focuses on social economic rights. So it says that the Nigerian government has to focus on key fundamental objectives. Now, I want to bring out what the three ones I call the three constitutional operatives of Nigeria. The first is growth. Every parliament in Nigeria, and this also applies to West Africa because we run almost the same constitution, must ensure that public policies aim at economic growth. So if a policy cannot lead to growth, it fails the constitutional imperative number one. Number two is that that policy must also lead to social justice, which is it creates equal access. There was a time in this parliament when the previous government wanted to borrow a lot of money. And we did analysis. The Southeast Caucus of the House of Reps hired me. I looked at the proposed borrowings. The projects were skewed in favor of some region against others. So that offends social justice imperative. You have to ensure that the borrowings are used to finance projects that will have some equal balance across the country. That is what the founding fathers had in mind on social justice imperative. And the third imperative is what I call the regulatory imperative. The Nigerian economy must be regulated. And that's why the DMO and the FRA Act, I will show it later, provides for what the parliament should use to ensure that both the projects and the borrowing are regulated. Our constitution does not support the idea of laissez-faire. That means any policy, no, just privatize, give to private sector, PPP, borrow money. No, the government must continue to regulate those projects. Next slide. Okay, just to, some basic about Nigeria, since we are hosting this event, but this is actually representative of West Africa, and in many cases, maybe worse or slightly better in many cases. But just using CR's 3 approach, unemployment, poverty. You see where we are in poverty? Almost 40% of Nigerians live in acute poverty. Now, what that means, it has implications for borrowing and where you borrow and what you borrow for. Because there are projects that can further expand or reduce this poverty. If you look at China, China from 1978 reduced poverty drastically and took millions out of poverty. That China's budget and policies, it discovered that they were timed to become labor-intense production. So China went from low technology, labor-based, therefore expanded earning and income, improved rural income, invested in rural cottage, the TVC, the town village enterprise, TVE, was, instead of privatizing, China used village enterprises to grow wealth. If you look at unemployment, well, this is the old methodology. Now we have changed it to 4.something%, but then we were the second largest in the world after South Africa. And then, of course, underemployment and so on. Next slide. Inequality. At some point, it was reported in 2016 that 5 richest Nigerians had 29.9 billion then. And what was remarkable for this is that they had enough money to lift all Nigerians above poverty level, measured at $1.90. They had enough money to, so being billionaire is not a problem. I'm looking at inequality. Nigeria has one of the highest Gini inequality. Next slide. Okay. Now, so we've seen the nexus of debt and development. So the question then is, some fundamental truths I want to talk about debt and development. First, is that debt is an alternative to internal capital formation. Development requires financing, which can come through domestic savings or borrowing. Arthur Lewis was the first and only black Nobel laureate in economics. In those days, the idea was that you need to save nationally about 12 to 14% to have a chance to develop. So countries need to have high-level national savings. That's what Asia had. They save a lot of money. And that's why you look at sovereign wealth funds like in Norway, Finland, even Dubai. That's national saving. Now, when countries don't have the discipline to save, then their next alternative is borrowing, because you need capital. Secondly, so ordinarily, public finance, development should be financed with domestic savings. But when you cannot do that, you borrow. So when you are going to develop without capital formation, you resort to borrowing. And then, of course, debt will be serviced by export earning like in Nigeria, or you can also, so it will constrain import and lead to more borrowing. So it becomes a vicious circle. Next slide. Okay. The key point here is that there is a direct relationship which is positive when debt is used for capital projects that are well designed and implemented to drive employment and income. So if you borrow and well designed and well implemented, then it drives you towards development that may have spillover effect that helps you to pay off. That's why oftentimes when we campaign against too much borrowing, they say, oh, look at America, look at China. They borrow a lot more than you. But they have more, first, absorptive capacity for debts. Two, they have a better structure to translate borrowing to projects that within the tenure of that debt could have created multiple wealth, and then from abundance, you pay off. But our borrowing is either not to capital projects, and even when it's capital projects, they're not well designed and implemented. So you have a double whammy. You borrow, then the proceed of borrowing does not expand their productive base, in which case you will still use your poverty to pay. And that's where Africa got into the serious debt crisis in the 1980s that led to demand for debt forgiveness, which Nigeria finally got off debt in 2012, I think. But we are back, 2011, we are back to serious debt. So this is one of the issues. And then indirectly, there's a negative correlation when debts are used for recurrent expenditure that do not increase employment or sustainable income. So debt servicing is a fixed charge on domestic income and savings. As the size of debt grows or the interest rises, debt services charge increases. Next slide. Now, I talk about, the most important determinant of the impact of debt is what we call basic transfer. Now, basic transfer is the foreign exchange inflow or outflow related to a country's borrowing, the quantitative difference between the net capital inflow, which is called gross inflow minus amortization, on past debt and interest payment on existing or accumulated debt. So let's forget the mathematics. What this means is that as we borrow, we are increasing our debt stock, we are increasing our debt services charge, and then the charge keep increasing, and you get to a point where it affects your balance of payment and your export earnings, and then your capacity to service the debts. Next slide. So I can get to, okay. These are just basic timeline. Next slide, let's leave this. Okay, how, what Nigeria has been borrowing and so on and so forth. Next slide. I will show some, as at June 2021, this is far old. Next slide. Okay, there are different Nigerian governments borrowing under, this is under President Buhari. You see, he's borrowing. Next slide. Jonathan, a different year. Next slide. President Yar'Adua, who borrowed less. And then, next slide. Obasanjo, who finally paid off debts, and you can see we started borrowing again. Next slide. Okay. So the idea here, we didn't put Tinubu because the government is still borrowing, but at the last count, this government has borrowed more than all these governments that have gone before. Now, the problem is that our people says that our debt to GDP is small, which is okay. The World Bank has a standard for debt to GDP, and that standard means if your debt to GDP ratio, meaning how much of your debt over your GDP, how much is it if you compare with the GDP? So if you look at Nigeria, we had about 21.3% in 2018. Our GDP has shrunken since then, so it should be more than this. World Bank says 22.5% is okay. But today, debt service to revenue is the worst. We are spending, as of January, it was 144%. What that means that for every 100 naira we earn, we borrow extra 44 naira to service, not to pay debt. So I want to tell us that what we should be looking at in debt management is the debt to servicing, because that's what constrains your capacity to fund recurrent and capital expenditure. Debt to GDP might be okay, but debt to servicing is very bad. In most countries, it's about 15%, highest 2025. But in Nigeria, as of January, it was 144. That's not, which means 45% of the budget allocated for 2025 is going to go to debt servicing. That's a lot. Next slide. I tried to give some debt sustainability comparison. As at that time, you can see that Nigeria is in a bad, both debt servicing to revenue. As at 2027, revenue gap is high for Nigeria. Debt service is high. Debt to GDP in Nigeria might not be too high. Look at Ghana, which means their GDP is small, but we are servicing debt with more of our revenue than they are doing. Next slide. Okay, so with all this scenario, how should the parliament be dealing with this? That's what I want to focus on. Next slide. First, I look at the various laws, look at the Nigerian system, the various laws that define debt to GDP debt management. First, the Constitution. Second, we talk about the Finance Control and Management Act, 1958, Audit Act, DMO, Public Procurement Act, Fiscal Responsibility Act, Fiscal Regulation Act, Public Service Act, Treasury Circular, Federal Inland Revenue Service Act, Central Bank Act. So what I've done here is to lay out the various toolbox for purpose of legislative control. What are the legal framework that we use? Next slide. Next slide, yeah. Okay, core constitutional principles. No, can you go back, sorry? Next slide, go back. I think we got something wrong. Okay, that's fine, go back, yeah, it's right. Go, yes, forward, sorry, forward. I'm sorry, forward, yes. Okay, so here, we look at core constitutional principles for public debt management. First is separation of power, federalism. We talk about legislative appropriation and approval of public expenditure, public value, legislative oversight, competitiveness and value for money, prudence and effectiveness. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. Okay, so separation of power is actually the strongest concept in public finance management. Why is it so? First, it gives this assembly the power to do things that the federal government, even though the executive branch has the power to run the economy, the power of appropriation is in the parliament. The power of fiscal oversight is in the parliament. And so separation of power is a concept that is well known in Nigerian constitution. Next slide. Okay. So like I mentioned, you can see different components of separation of power. The executive can manage the economy, the legislator can deal with the oversight and regulation, and the judiciary with adjudication. Next slide. So I'll be fast here. Next slide, yeah. Okay. So now the point I want to make is that go back. The constitution is designed in a way that the executive power and its exercise is limited. And this is oftentimes, when I was a special advisor to the Senate president here long ago, I used to say that Nigerians say that the Nigerian presidency is too powerful. It's not true. It's actually the Nigerian parliament that is too powerful. And I'll tell you why. Unlike in the US Constitution, where Article 1, Article 2, and others are distinct, Section 5 power of the president is conditioned to two things. It is limited according to the express provision of the Constitution and the extent of law made by Parliament. So what that means is this: except where the Constitution bestows on the president an express authority, every of his power can be controlled, reduced, removed by ordinary law of Parliament. So who is stronger? The Parliament. So the Parliament, that's why when you did your Petroleum Act before, and you say only the Minister of Petroleum can allocate oil block, and the President allocated oil block, the Supreme Court says the President cannot, it must be the Minister of Petroleum. And that's why Nigerian presidents now answer Minister of Petroleum. What does that mean? It means that the Parliament can describe these rights as they want. Next slide. Okay, so this is what I just mentioned. Shall extend to the execution and maintenance of the Constitution. Number one, all laws made by the National Assembly. So whatever the National Assembly makes law, it conditions the president's extent of his power under Section 5(2). Next slide. Okay. So that's the purpose I tried to make. So although the president has personal power, it's subject to whatever law National Assembly makes. Next slide. Okay. Now, there's also judicial limitation of this power, which means any law, the present power is subject to him, but he has to be subject to the Constitution, and the National Assembly is the one that makes the Constitution, that interprets the Constitution. The judiciary interprets the Constitution. Next slide. Okay, so if you look at National Assembly as a financial watchword, so the first point we've made is that National Assembly has powers to define how the executive can make laws, and once it defines it, it stays. Again, now we want to look at as a watchdog. What does that mean? It means that the Constitution has designated National Assembly as lawmaker as well as watchdog, and that's the essence of Section 4, 2, and 3, and sections 80 to 88. Next slide. Okay. So the first, the power of legislative oversight. So the lawmaking power includes the power of oversight. Oversight is an established national understanding of the implication of lawmaking power. There are 6 components of oversight, 6 components of oversight power. The first is investigative power, investigative process. 2, impeachment process. 3, confirmatory process. 4, appropriation process. 5, authorization process. And 6, budgeting process. So all of these are contained in section 80 to 88 of the Constitution. Next slide. Now, this is where I want to pay more attention to. The National Assembly has made a law to define how it can exercise legislative oversight. So, if you look at, for example, item 7 of the Constitution, item 7 lists borrowing of money within outside Nigeria for the purpose of the Federation on any law or any of the states as within the legislative competence of the National Assembly to make law as well as its oversight function. So item 50 of the same schedule lists public debt of the Federation. So this section is very clear that the oversight of borrowing lies with the National Assembly. And as I argue, it's the nature of this legislative power the National Assembly make laws to regulate the borrowing of money by any government in Nigeria, whether federal or state, by virtue of section 555 of the Constitution that stipulates the manner for the President to exercise executive power of the Federation, subject to any law made by the National Assembly. Any proposed borrowing that does not follow the condition laid by these laws will be incompetent. So if government borrows money contrary to these regulations the National Assembly has made, it shall be incompetent. Next slide. Okay. So if you look at the legislative power of the National Assembly, you discover that the Constitution lists borrowing of money within and outside the country by the federal government or any state. Secondly, no, next slide, sorry, it's a repetition. Next slide, yeah. Next slide. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Legislative power of the purse and public finance management. The first point I argue there is that the Constitution prohibits public expenditure without legislative approval, except in rare circumstances where such expenditure will be ratified subsequently. So every public procurement expenditure must come there. 2, any withdrawal or expenditure that is not approved or ratified is unconstitutional. 3, appropriation of funds is a legislative process that must comply strictly with the Constitution. And 4, the power of the purse commits the President to due process and creates an oversight mechanism that is effectively done with integrity and courage. Now, the point here is very clear that being the power of the purse belongs to the legislature because it appropriates, it oversights borrowing, it ensures that the terms of the FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and the DMO Act is complied with. Next slide. Okay. Again, if you look at section 88 of the Constitution, it talks about the power of the National Assembly to oversight the conduct of the branches. Oversight covers all matters relating to any law made by the National Assembly or the implementation of the law or any appropriation. So the National Assembly's power of oversight, as the Court of Appeal has recognized, relates to 3 things. If they make law, they can oversight. If they appropriate, they oversight. So that means any law, Appropriation Act is a law oversight. Budget to parastatals create obligation of oversight. Next slide. Okay. Now, in reality, this power is not unlimited. And so there are limitations. In the case of Aerofire and House of Reps, the Nigerian Court of Appeal says, yes, oversight is a great power, but it has to be subject to either lawmaking, either review of budget appropriated, or relative to the process of making law. So in Aerofire's case, the Court of Appeal, House of Reps was angry about his comment he made abusing the House, and the House issued a warrant purportedly as part of its oversight power. And the court says no, the only way you can exercise those powers is that you are either reviewing a law, making a law, or reviewing appropriated funds. Anything outside that is not part of oversight. Enough. Next slide. Okay, the same with the case of Tony Momo and the Senate of Nigeria, where the Court of Appeal, Nemeka Siago, argued that Section 82.2 is designed to eliminate abuse. Any invitation by the House to any person outside the purpose defined by Section 72 of the Constitution is invalid. No power exists outside the section for general investigation for aggrandizement of the House. The point there is that the power to investigate is limited to when you are looking for investigating abuse of budgets or law. There's no general power. Maybe somebody could quarrel with somebody, or somebody has an issue. The House does not have general investigative power. That's what the Constitution is trying to say. Next slide. Okay. So this is very important legal framework for valid exercise of borrowing power. In the last government, the federal government borrowed up to now. They borrow money contrary to FRA. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is very strict. It's clear that any government of the federation or its agencies and corporations that desires to borrow money shall specify the purpose for which the borrow is intended and present a cost-benefit analysis detailing the economic and social benefit of the borrowing. Now, this is the problem. We don't seem to have good cost-benefit analysis. Why is cost-benefit analysis important? Don't forget the first part of this paper. We talk about the link between debt and development, or lack of it. So what the Constitution and the legal framework expects is that when you are borrowing, you have to lay before the House cost-benefit analysis. Why is this money needed? In the next 10 years, what investments will come out of it? How will it increase growth, reduce unemployment, reduce poverty? This is the requirement why it's important. So you must show prior authorization and you must show approval by this House. Next slide. So he talks about the legal framework under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If you look at that act very well, it talks about first, Section 44(3). Nothing in this act shall be constituted to authorize borrowing in excess of the limit set out in Section 44. 44 provides, it said the Commission shall verify on a quarterly basis compliance with the limit and conditions for borrowing for each government of the Federation. If you look at Section 44(5), it still talks about the specific responsibility of the National Assembly and the Central Bank of Nigeria. The Debt Management Office shall maintain comprehensive, reliable, and current electronic database of internal and external borrowing. They maintain that database. The DMO does that, and the House should also have their own. Next slide. Now, if you look at the DMO Act, it provides also in Section 31, clearly, the Minister of the Federation shall not approve any external borrowing unless the terms and conditions should have been laid before the National Assembly before approval. So if the House has not approved the term and conditions, no borrowing. Again, before the federal government and the state to get a loan, that must be approved by the minister. But the most important thing is that even the banks themselves must ensure these approvals. My focus is National Assembly must have approved by a resolution. Next slide. Section 25 lays out approval procedure. The critical thing is that each of these you must submit to the President of the National Assembly, and there must be approval of those terms by resolution. The terms of the grant, the benefits Nigeria stands to derive from the loan, and the state of the reduction of existing loan between the government. So the National Assembly has to do all this by looking at what is the benefit of the loan to Nigeria. Next slide. I will round up by showing what cost-benefit analysis means. The Investment and Security Act also provides for the same level of prudence and oversight before loans are taken. Next slide. Okay. So, what are the legal conditions before valid loan and borrowing? 3 of them. There must be, every application before the National Assembly must be accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis detailing the economic and social benefits for the purpose of the loan. Very important. There must be a prior authorization from the minister before. Thirdly, the proceeds of that borrowing shall solely be applied towards long-term capital expenditure. So 3 things are involved here. You must convince the National Assembly through a written cost-benefit analysis. 2, you must have gotten prior approval, that's fine. 3, this borrowing is only for long-term capital expenditure. Reason, like I showed you in the earlier slide, investment borrowings for recurrent expenditure creates negative indirect constraint on growth and development. Next slide. Okay, so what is cost-benefit analysis? You know, the last time President Buhari applied for a lot of loan, I wrote a petition on behalf of some Senate House members, and I showed that there was no cost-benefit analysis. For example, NTA says they're going to borrow $500 million so that they will be like CNN. Is that a cost-benefit analysis? How will that impact on the well-being of the country? So this is what we call cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis asks these questions. What are the bad and good effects of imaginable policy? Will we save 1 life, 10 lives, 1,000 lives? Will we impose costs on consumers? What will those costs be exactly? What policies hurt workers and small businesses? So, if so, precisely how much? Cost-benefit analysis are detailed, they are granular. You have to go to the basics. This is how we want to invest the money. This is our own expected return. This is how this, so that when you are approving it, you are approving it knowing that this will build up to economic growth and human development. Next slide. San Jose University gave us another one. It says, cost-benefit analysis, CBA, estimates and total up the equivalent money value of the benefits and cost to the community of projects to establish whether they are worldwide. These projects may be dams or highway, or can be training program, or can be healthcare system. Now, this is the trick. People have PhD on this. You see, we can translate somebody's life into more money. I can give you a lifespan numerical figure that if you kill 40 people, this is the value in terms of money. They look at their training, their upbringing, what they can earn. So when you are talking about projects, you have to give us figures that tell us what we gain and what we lose. Next slide. So how do you determine cost-benefit analysis? Sorry. Okay, so how do you determine it? We say you determine it by first, a cost-benefit analysis to focus on the cost of the proposed project in the short, medium, and long term. Not just now. What's the cost? Short, medium, and long term. 2, again, it should clearly articulate the benefit of the program or project to the economy in the short, medium, and long term. A cost-benefit analysis will show how the project or program contributes to the strategic implementation of the core policy, trade of government, economic development program, and aligned with the 2020 medium-term implementation framework. So the argument here is very simple. Next slide, so I can round up now. So what's the point? I think this is the final 2 slides before I go. The National Assembly defines its own rules. Therefore, it has a capacity to, decide what it has to do in terms of procedure. Next slide. But once they have passed, you have a right to say, but once you have passed the law, you have to follow what the law says. I think that the point I want to make here is that the reason why you have the audit oversight and all that is that you want to operationalize these processes. Next slide. I think the slides can be given. Of course, Auditor General's and Public Finance Management Office, they are there. The question is their reports. Are they properly, they do the proper report and they are available to the public, and can the committee also take them on? Next slide. I'll run fast. So what's the weakness of the Auditor General's report? Well, many NGOs do not submit, of course. The finance committees have not been consistent with strict oversight. Thirdly, finance committees also lack the technical and capacity to do this. And of course, corruption is also a problem. Next slide so that I can finish off. Well, we'll talk about federalism. I can leave that. Next slide. What this means is that they have several layers. See, federal government, local government, how can you have fiscal discipline across the value chain? It requires more tools, especially when governors are claiming independence. Yes, next slide. Next slide, yes. Go ahead. Yes, this is just the basic offices. I think I want to round up. Yes. Nigeria has not been lacking in developing instruments for public management reform, but oftentimes they don't work. Next slide. Conclusion. So, Nigeria public debt is not sustainable for 2 reasons. Yes, GDP, we're not too far. GDP versus public debt. But in terms of debt servicing, it's too high. We have a serious revenue problem. Again, we have a productivity problem. So we're not able to grow capital at a rate to compensate for borrowing. And finally, I talk about development as a process. Development requires transformation, grave physical crisis plus grave revenue shortfall, plus growing poverty, plus increasing inequality will lead to state failure. So we need to arrest fiscal crisis in order to create room for improvement in development, reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and then forestall state failure. Thank you so much for our audience.
Thank you very much for that very scholarly work presentation. The microphone runs back to the President.
Okay. Le Mali.
Président de la Commission des finances et de l'économie du Conseil national de transition du Mali. Alors, nous venons de suivre avec intérêt le brillant exposé du professeur Amadi et sur l'évolution du rôle des parlements dans la gouvernance de la dette publique, le cadre juridique et constitutionnel, défis et opportunités pour l'engagement parlementaire. À la suite de ce brillant exposé, j'espère que, qui a été surtout centré sur le cas nigérian, je sais que chacun de nous dispose d'une petite expérience en la matière dans la gestion de sa dette publique. Alors, je vais vous demander, ceux qui veulent intervenir, qu'ils se fassent inscrire pour les différentes questions à poser ou même des contributions. Et à la suite de cela, le présidium et l'orateur principal se feront le devoir d'apporter leurs éléments de réponse. Voilà, je vous remercie. Vous, c'est... On va dire Fayon. Fayon du Bénin.
What you do is you can raise your name tag if you intend to speak, and Côte d'Ivoire.
Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Oui. Votre nom, monsieur? Ah, honorable Camara. Sierra Leone. Oui? Qui d'autre? Ah oui, d'accord.
All right. Thank you very much.
C'est lui qui veut intervenir. Je suis en train de prendre les noms.
Okay.
Voilà. Il n'y a plus d'autres intervenants. Vous, c'est... Anthony. Daou. Garou. Garou.
Garou.
Garou.
Oh, yeah. Anthony
Comme le
Garou,
loup Garou.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Garou. Côte d'Ivoire. Oui. Ensuite, votre nom, honorable?
Yes, mine is basically a question. My name is Dr. William Umuna. Thank you.
Peut-être il faut faire le relais. Qu'est-ce qu'il a dit?
Sherif Ahmed Diko.
Ça marche pas, marche pas.
Sénégal, Sherif Ahmed Diko.
Sori?
Sherif.
Shérif?
Oui, Ahmed Diko. Président
Ahmed.
de la commission des finances, oui.
Ahmed Dibo?
Diko.
Diko? Sénégal?
Oui.
Hello, sir. My name is Dr. William. The last name is O-M-U-N-A.
Dr. Williams?
Umuna, yes, sir. And mine is centered on some questions based on the prior presentation. Thank you.
Comment? Ça suffit? D'accord. C'est tout? Bon ben, nous allons commencer. Alors nous allons commencer avec Monsieur Camara de Sierra Leone, qui semble un peu plus pressé là, pour sa question. Monsieur Camara, honorable Camara, pour votre question, ou... Oui.
Thank you very much. Honorable Abdul Karim Kamal from Sierra Leone.
Ça marche pas.
Mine are there are concerns the professor raised while he was making presentation.
Ça marche?
He presented a situation in which we need to understand the role of the PACs
Voilà,
in our
non, ça
various
marche.
countries and how do the PACs
C'est
relate
ce
to
que
the
j'ai.
public. Because one of the things that is very much important and that is making less importance of the PAC in our various countries is the fact that we do recoup monies from projects and from government officers who do not implement projects well. We do our oversight well. But the trouble is, how much do the citizens know of what we're doing in our various country remains the bottleneck for transparencies in our country. So firstly, he made it very clear that we must have a public engagement to ensure the people have enough education on the audit reports that are being tabled in our parliaments, and ensure we bring the people along whilst we're doing the PAC work. Or else we find ourselves in a situation in which, if you go to most countries in West Africa, the citizens perceive parliaments to be corrupt because they don't have the required knowledge over what we do, even in fighting corruption and transparency. So one of the take-homes we must take from this conference is a situation in which we must hasten to bring the public education of the PAC to the citizens and to our voters. With this, the fight for transparency across West Africa will not just be limited in the hands of members of parliament, but will also be able to carry the civil society along, the media practitioners who are also themselves very much interested in the issue of transparency. But if we bottle the issue of just PAC and transparency to just parliamentary work and limiting it to the constitutions and the documentations within parliament, it is work in futility. Nobody knows what we are doing, nobody knows what we're recovering, and nobody knows exactly where they go to complain when there are issues they perceive to be wrong implementations. Mind you, he said it clear. We are to oversight the laws we make. We are to oversight the disbursement we make as a parliament. And this disbursement affects the people we are representing, whether in the health sector, whether it's in education, whether it's in other fields. So if you do a transparency check without letting the people know what you're doing, the people don't understand, and therefore they give us no credence. And until we are able to carry the people along, the work of the PAC is of no use across West Africa. So as part of WAAP, one of our major take-homes should be, how do we involve the people we represent alongside the transparency and accountability of institution, or else it is good as we have never been here. So we must go back home, heighten the tension of education to our people. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, honorable Camara, pour votre intervention qui est plutôt une contribution vraiment enrichissante sur les débats à tenir. Nous vous remercions infiniment. À la suite de monsieur Camara, de l'honorable Camara, je vais vous demander vraiment de limiter les interventions. Et chaque intervenant aura alors une petite minute pour dire tout ce qu'il a sur le cœur et aussi question aussi bien que contribution. Merci beaucoup. Alors, à la suite de l'honorable Camara, nous allons demander à l'honorable Fayon du Bénin de prendre le micro pour sa question ou...
Merci beaucoup. Moi, je voudrais poser la question tout en le félicitant pour la qualité de son exposé, au professeur de nous dire, est-ce qu'il a eu le temps de faire le comparatif entre le moment où le Naira était arrimé au dollar américain et le moment où le Naira a été décroché du dollar américain, quel a été l'impact sur le budget? La deuxième question, est-ce que le professeur s'est penché sur les risques budgétaires liés à l'endettement et les facteurs d'atténuation? Il a exposé l'évolution de la dette du président Yaradua au dernier président, mais il a manqué de nous faire connaître l'évolution démographique. Qu'en est-il du dividende démographique? chers participants, je voudrais attirer l'attention que la dette ressort aussi du poids colonial, la déportation des esclaves, des Africains comme main-d'œuvre qui ont contribué à former le capital fixe de l'autre côté. Et je souhaiterais qu'on ait une vision claire en termes de justice et réparation de ce que nous devrons, tout en abordant cette thématique, ne pas manquer de mettre le doigt sur la réparation justice. C'est-à-dire, il y a des pays aujourd'hui qui sont surendettés et l'endettement là provient de la détérioration des termes de l'échange organisés par le colon. Alors, c'est pour ça que je voudrais finir en demandant effectivement que les parlementaires que nous sommes puissent aller dans le sens de l'appropriation et dans le sens de l'exercice de notre pouvoir de contrôle de la dette. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, honorable Fayon. Votre question tourne autour de l'encours de la dette publique avec la forte fluctuation qu'a connue le Naira par rapport au dollar. Et ensuite, vous avez donné des contributions. Je ne sais pas si il faut recenser les questions ou si le professeur voilà, va donner ces éléments de réponse tout de suite. Hein? On finit avec tout le monde? D'accord, ok. Merci beaucoup. Alors, le suivant, le président Youssouf Traoré.
Merci. Je voudrais d'abord féliciter le présentateur pour son intervention. Ma question va s'axer sur des questions de compréhension. Je félicite le présentateur pour la puissance, la force que le Nigeria met au sein du Parlement. Mais ma préoccupation se situe à un niveau sur ce que nous appelons les différents régimes qui dirigent nos États. Le régime parlementaire, le régime semi-présidentiel, le régime présidentiel. Le fonctionnement n'est pas identique. Et ensuite, il a dit les lois appartiennent au Parlement. Mais il y a ce que nous appelons les propositions de loi émanant du Parlement et les projets de loi émanant de l'exécutif. Donc, dans l'appropriation de ces lois, il est tout à fait normal que si c'est un projet de loi, souvent le parlementaire ne peut qu'entériner ce projet de loi. Bien sûr que nous le votons, mais ça nous amène pas trop à réfléchir sur les... Et puis il y a ce que nous appelons aussi les ordonnances. Les ordonnances, nous savons que les présidents souvent ratifient des ordonnances, et quand ces ordonnances reviennent à l'Assemblée, nous ne faisons que les ratifier. Ça aussi c'est un problème pour la gestion des problèmes liés à la dette. Donc, j'arrive aussi sur la question qui me préoccupe, c'est les règles dont il a parlé concernant l'endettement. Les règles régies, soit, comme il a dit, il y a 3 règles, le coût et bénéfice, l'autorisation ministérielle, les investissements à long terme. C'est-à-dire, lorsque vous devez vous endetter, vous devez tenir compte d'un investissement à long terme pour permettant ainsi de pouvoir rentabiliser ces investissements. Donc, mais malheureusement, l'endettement s'est fait et le Parlement est mis devant les faits accomplis. Je ne sais pas si au Nigeria c'est comme ça, mais chez nous, souvent, c'est la problématique qui se pose sur les problèmes de l'endettement et du suivi de la dette. Donc, voici autant de préoccupations qui m'ont laissé un peu perplexe dans l'intervention de notre brillant professeur. Professeur, aidez-nous, parce que pour nous, l'expérience du Nigeria nous permettra aussi d'aller améliorer nos conditions de vie et même pourquoi pas vous inviter en Côte d'Ivoire pour que vous venez exposer. Merci.
Honorable Youssouf Traoré. Alors le suivant, c'est Honorable Garou de la Côte d'Ivoire. Honorable Garou, voilà pour votre intervention.
Merci. Je voudrais joindre ma voix à celle des personnes qui sont passées avant moi pour féliciter notre conférencier prier que son exposé puisse être traduit en français pour nous autres, parce que c'est tellement intéressant. Personnellement, c'est une question sur laquelle je travaille en matière de dettes. Donc, je voudrais prier que cela soit transcrit en français pour qu'on joigne au document qu'on doit nous remettre. D'ailleurs, comme toutes les autres interventions qui ont précédé son intervention. La deuxième chose, c'est pour dire que le problème de la dette est une préoccupation mondiale aujourd'hui. Vous suivez l'actualité en France actuellement. Le débat, il est hardi, il est dur, tout comme aux États-Unis, donc partout dans le monde. Mais le problème est d'autant plus crucial dans nos pays africains que le pouvoir que les populations ont donné à leurs parlementaires est parfois difficile à exercer dans certains pays. Et pourtant, ce n'est pas une question que je pose, c'est une contribution. Les parlementaires doivent être en amont et en aval dans la détermination de la politique et de l'endettement. En amont, et il a dit tout à l'heure, on devrait pouvoir, au moment de contracter les dettes, quand même solliciter les parlementaires, parce que c'est eux qui autorisent les impôts et tout ça, pour savoir effectivement si cela est profitable. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, le débat, il est où? Les dettes, dans certains pays, sont utilisées parfois pour les mettre dans les infrastructures, les bâtiments, en comparaison par rapport à la condition de vie, donc au plan social des populations. Donc, il y a parfois loin entre les investissements en termes d'infrastructures et l'amélioration des... Or, la majorité de nos populations, à 90%, c'est le bas peuple. Ce n'est pas des gens qui ont des voitures, ce n'est pas des gens qui ont des avions, ce n'est pas des gens qui vont venir habiter dans les grands immeubles, les grands investissements. Eux, ils veulent voir leurs conditions de vie améliorées en matière de santé, en matière d'école, ainsi de suite. Que leurs produits puissent être achetés à des prix rémunérateurs. Donc, il y a ce débat qu'on appelle en d'autres termes l'IDH, l'indice de développement humain, dont il a fait état tout à l'heure. Et c'est très important. Donc, là aussi, nous les parlementaires, nous devons prendre notre responsabilité. C'est que nous ne faisons pas toujours. Parce que dans ce débat, parfois, ça devient trop politique, ça devient trop partisan. Ça devient trop partisan. Or, sur cette question, parce que c'est nous qui allons rembourser la population. Si ce n'est pas nous aujourd'hui, ce sont nos enfants pour demain. Donc, c'est une question sur laquelle nous devons réfléchir encore plus entre des universitaires, entre des hommes politiques, même entre les associations, les syndicats. Nous devons tous réfléchir sur cette question, peut-être organiser un jour une sorte de colloque sur la question africaine au niveau de l'Afrique. Donc, c'est très important. Donc, je voudrais donc souligner ça et dire que, bon, aujourd'hui, on parle de gouvernement ouvert, on parle de parlement ouvert. C'est pour traiter toutes ces questions. Le plan de gouvernement, open government, open parliament. Hein? Et c'est très important aujourd'hui que nous puissions rendre compte à nos populations de l'utilisation des dettes que nous avons contractées. C'est très important. Donc, c'est cette petite contribution que je voulais faire. Merci.
Merci pour la contribution, monsieur Honorable Garou. Je vous invite à plus de concision et de précision. J'avais dit tantôt, chaque orateur aura 1 minute, mais nous venons de décompter pour l'honorable Garou 10 bonnes minutes. Non, je rigole. Voilà. Maintenant, honorable Chérif Ahmed Diko du Sénégal, pour votre intervention. Soyez vraiment concis. Le micro à l'honorable Chérif Diko.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Nous remercions, n'est-ce pas, le professeur Amadi pour son brillant exposé. Moi, j'ai une question et une contribution.
Très bien.
La question, elle est relative au Nigeria. Donc, on nous dit, le professeur nous dit, si le Nigeria utilise 45% de son budget pour payer le service de la dette, ces emprunts sont-ils mis dans des projets productifs capables de contribuer au remboursement de celle-ci dans le long terme? Ça, c'est la question. Maintenant, autre chose, vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que chez nous, il y a la question qui est agitée, donc notamment au Sénégal, où le rôle du Parlement dans la gouvernance de la dette publique a évolué vers une supervision plus accrue et plus grande, initiée, n'est-ce pas, par un audit de la dette publique en 2025 qui a révélé des irrégularités et un endettement supérieur aux estimations initiales. Suite à cela, une volonté de renforcer le contrôle parlementaire a émergé visant à améliorer le suivi des finances publiques et à assurer une gestion plus responsable de la dette, notamment à travers l'élaboration des lois de finances prévoyant des mécanismes de contrôle budgétaire plus stricts et la gestion transparente des ressources publiques. Donc c'était un peu ça ma contribution. Je vous remercie.
Beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, honorable Diko. Merci pour cette très bonne question sur... c'était qui? Professeur William. Ah, d'accord. Professeur Williams, le micro au professeur Williams. Il est là? Voilà. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Sam Amadi made a very brilliant presentation, very superb, especially in the areas of legal precondition for valid borrowing under the Department of Debt Management Office Act. But the question is, are those preconditions being followed by the Parliament? Then the second one is, that is critical, is Nigeria public debt is not sustainable. And he cited two examples. One of them is revenue problem. The second one he cited was productivity problems. I want him to explain the disparity. Then the next one is on the third prong. He did a presentation with some slides. Can we be privileged to get copies of those? Thank you. That's my submission, sir.
Voilà. Attiade, honorable Attiade du Bénin. Je vous en prie. Ah, d'accord. Après, ce serait toi. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur le modérateur. Je voudrais aussi, à mon tour, féliciter le professeur pour sa présentation et dire que je suis entièrement d'accord avec lui quand il dit que le Parlement a un pouvoir énorme, mais un pouvoir qu'il sous-estime, puisque c'est la loi qui donne le pouvoir et c'est le Parlement qui vote la loi. Mais souvent, le Parlement donne plus de pouvoir à l'exécutif que pour lui-même. Et, monsieur le professeur, je voudrais avoir votre avis sur le rôle que l'exécutif ou le Parlement lui-même tend à se donner en ce moment en autorisant le gouvernement à faire des prêts sans passer par l'approbation de l'Assemblée nationale. Dans certains parlements, cela a été constitutionnalisé et comme vous le savez, les prêts devenant de plus en plus rares, les pays se ruent sur ce qui est disponible et pensent que en allant demander l'approbation, ça peut prendre le temps et dans la Constitution, il est déjà donné à l'exécutif l'autorisation de signer des accords de prêt et c'est 3 mois après que l'exécutif, à travers le ministère des Finances, informe l'Assemblée nationale qui n'a que le rôle de constat. Que pensez-vous de cette procédure anormale qui est devenue réglementaire. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, honorable William. Achade. Voilà, maintenant, honorable Gérard.
Merci, honorable président modérateur, pour votre indulgence. Je voudrais féliciter le professeur Amadi pour sa brillante communication qui est très claire. Tous les concepts y sont. Nous avons bien compris. Moi, je voudrais seulement m'appesantir sur les défis auxquels les parlementaires sont confrontés en face de cette problématique de contrôle de la dette. Et le défi, vous savez que les députés, les parlementaires ne sont pas pour la plupart des financiers, tous des financiers. Maintenant, en face de la complexité des différents outils qui sont aujourd'hui les véhicules de la dette, les eurobonds, le partenariat public-privé, les dettes multilatérales. Alors, il faut comprendre avant de contrôler. Vous n'avez pas... Quel conseil ou quelle solution, quelle recommandation vous formulez à l'endroit des parlementaires pour pouvoir, en face de ces outils complexes, jouer convenablement le rôle qui leur incombe. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, honorable Gérard. Alors, nous avons recensé pratiquement toutes les questions et interventions. Il reste maintenant au professeur Sam, alors d'apporter ces éléments de réponse, étant bien entendu qu'il pourra être complété par ceux qui veulent intervenir à la suite de ce... Voilà, c'est ça. Oui, non, lui, c'était... Merci beaucoup. Professeur.
Merci beaucoup, Président.
Je vous en prie.
Merci beaucoup, President. Okay, thank you so much, sir. I think it's more. Should I stand, sir? I can stand. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think I can stand since I have the mic. I think it's more of very, very important comments and contributions. I've made notes to further improve my research. But I will just respond to a few things because I have just 3 minutes according to organizers. So I will, if I miss out any problem, sorry for that. I agree with Honorable Kamara from Sierra Leone that public participation is key for that kind of oversight because the legislator is not an oracle. You don't have to know everything. In fact, that also answers the question about capacity that was asked here. I used to tell people when they say legislators, this and that, PhD, all over the world, legislators are not supposed to be the smartest people. Some of them are very smart, but that's not the reason for being in politics. People can choose anybody to represent them if they like you. So we're expecting the legislator to be full of experts. And that's why it's important that you have a way to leverage your knowledge outside the legislature. One of that is through public participation. We used to have, even in Nigeria, we have a lot of public hearing. But as a problem, it's called selection problem. How do you select who to hear? And so I used to be a special advisor on research and strategy to Senate President, and I argue for 2 things. I say, first, interest test. Whose interest will be involved? Second test will be expertise test. Who knows something about this issue? So you don't fill it only with PhDs and experts. You also look for people who will be affected so that you have to know those who have information based on their own experience becomes part of the mix of facts. That's very important. And so dealing with the fact that today's public policy is a complexity. Even the experts themselves don't understand everything because the world is becoming more complex with minute information, minute specializations, and so on and so forth. So I want to recommend two things. Already, we have in Nigeria the NABRO, National Assembly Budget and such, but it should be made more stronger. All over the world, the parliament, in 1985, the African UN Economic Commission for Africa said that African parliaments are notoriously undercapacitated. It's still the same today in terms of support they give them, technical support, institutional agency. In the US, for example, there are over 100 tax finance-based centers that provide free services to parliament. They are funded by non-profits. So they are looking for honorable member to have them give you advisory free. So here in Nigeria, we don't have those things. So I think there should be a way to tie into private centers. It may be expensive to hire individuals. Just tell those centers that some of them have grants to provide those services. I think that's another way to deal with that. I think there's restorative justice. I think that's a big one that I think is honorable from Benin Republic, I think, if I'm right. Debts. When we had debt crisis in the 1980s, 90s, the argument was what we call unjust debts. That most of those debts were induced by multinationals. African leaders were forced to borrow money, keep borrowing, keep borrowing, keep borrowing. We call it odious debt. And so there was a moral argument for jubilee, write off the debts. But you see, whereas we can talk about colonialism and slavery and the work of these institutions, it's now the time for us to look at these debts. Yes, we can ask for justice and fairness, but we have to look at these debts as issues that we have to manage. Exchange rates are important. That's a good question. If you look at the exchange rate regime, which is also within the control of parliament, they should ask question, why should you devalue your exchange rate when you're not an export country? If you devalue much, then it's worse off. You're selling nothing. Your products are cheaper, your revenue is lower, they have to borrow money to supplement those revenue. It doesn't make sense to me. So I think that's really very, very important. Yes, it's true that debt is now a global issue, globally. The key question about it is infrastructure. We have to borrow money. Sometimes some of our countries are poor that we have to borrow, but you have to be smart in borrowing. There are short-term borrowing to deal with human development deficit, health, education, housing, because people have to survive to be productive. But what is required of parliament is to consciously know that this is what we are doing, and this is the possibilities and the risks and the losses and the gains. What is not permissible is just to accept and endorse borrowing plan. Because oftentimes, some of the borrowings are supplier interested. The people who ask to borrow money have earmarked projects that they want to, that borrowing to be used. That projects, if you look at 80%, the values go back to foreign countries. If you look at some of our projects, the value that remain on domestic economy is very low. So they say America has given you $150 million. Go and borrow $200 million from World Bank. If you look at the aggregate value addition, much of that procurement goes abroad. Toyota vehicles, all those machineries, the value is abroad. So we have to be strategic in balancing the need to provide for today's consumption and the long-term impact that those can have in economic development in the country. I think there are too many very important issues. So, parliamentary responsibility. What I hear is that the parliament, three things I hear, and I will conclude. One is that parliaments are often constrained by rules. Somebody mentioned rules that does not give you enough room to oversight the ESCO, who sometimes bring these motions. I heard one of the other members talk about rules that perhaps gives the executive more power in terms of borrowing. The key point of this, my message, is that if you look at the parliamentary system, the parliament anywhere, the power to make laws gives you the power to change rules and make rules more amenable to transparency and accountability. So yes, some of the rules are rigged against parliamentary oversight. The parliament should first write those rules to allow for more openness. Again, there's no silver bullet here. political convenience, political configuration will affect parliaments everywhere in the world. Parliament itself is very powerful, but parliament is like a giant tied by politics. You won't invent a new word entirely fresh. You have to manage with the situation you have and find ways to open up and expand the opportunities and the expanse of operation. That's the key point here. 45% of the budget for debt servicing. And the question is it tied to the economic program? Yes, most of these projects, borrowing, are defined for economic program. But this is the key here. Governments say that we are doing economic program does not necessarily mean that that program is useful. The collapse of our economy, the steel complex, we tried, we failed, the power project, everything we have failed in this country. It's not because there are no economic programs. Those programs were not properly oversighted. In terms of the presumptions about them, you can invest $2 billion borrowed, and the argument will tell you that this will help us grow the economy. By what percentage? What's the driver of that growth? How will this turn to growth? So what we're asking for is not sorcery. We are saying, let there be some materials you can use to make your own assessment of cost benefit. Nobody's perfect. It might be that the investment will not work out, but let us approve based on the basis that both executive, and this is what happens, when the parliament starts signaling to the executive that they want to follow that precondition, the executive will improve their own analytics, and there's some level of indolence or lack of competence in the executive. Sometimes they just dump it. But if they know that you raise questions, then they will prepare a better cost-benefit analysis and better request. What this does is that it will improve their own implementation, because the moment you do your rigorous work, it helps in making sure that you don't fail in implementation. Again, somebody talked about, finally, I think I should run up because small guy is here now following me. Are the preconditions being followed? Of course, the answer is no. Yes, I was issue around revenue and productivity. I think that was a good question. So when I say there are two problems, revenue problem is that we are borrowing because we don't have enough money. Maybe oil slump, we're not getting enough revenue from export, like Nigeria is almost a mono economy. Or we are selling cocoa, we are selling granules. So that's a revenue crisis. If you have enough money for your capital and recurrent expenditure, you will likely not borrow. A country is like a household. You have their income, and then the income reduces. Then your needs have not reduced. Then you have to borrow to supplement. That's the revenue crisis. But your long-term problem is that your productivity is what? Low. So even though it's a revenue problem, it's actually, in real sense, a productivity problem. Because when you are now producing better, you increase your revenue, and then you reduce borrowing. So those two problems are intertwined. One is short-term. We have no revenue. We have a gap. We have to fill it up. Just like a woman, we have no money. We used to pay 20,000 a month, but now we have only 15. We have to borrow 5. But it means that maybe the husband can think around, how do I expand income? How do I become more productive? How do I make better investments? So that in the next 2-3 years, I will be able to move from 20,000 to 40,000, in which case we don't have need for that 5,000. Finally, so I don't get a big knock from my guy. I think there are many good conversations, but yes, the president has powers that, see, the principles, every system of government is based on two things. Once you have a parliament, the parliament and the president, I teach constitutional law, they are always competing. Anytime you make a law, what you are doing is that you are reducing, clarifying the power of the president. Just let me give you an example. If you make a law on Electricity Act, like in Nigeria, electricity is executive business, but you are not telling the executive, before you announce a tariff, you must do A, B, C, D. What you are doing is carefully reducing president's discretion. So the president can no longer come up and wake up in the morning and increase tariff. He has to go through a methodology. And then you look at the methodology. The parliament and the executive branch are always in a rivalrous relationship. Either you are increasing their power or you're reducing it. And so that's why today you create regulatory agencies. Why? Now, the whole Federal Fiscal Responsibility Commission is built on the idea that you want to take the present power over finance and reshape it in a way that gives you capacity to second guess it. If there was no law, it becomes total discretion. If you create law, you have combined, reduced, constrained, and proceduralized executive power, the way that gives you capacity to monitor and oversight. You can't oversight executive discretion, but once you make law, then you bring it within the domain of legislative oversight. Thank you so much. I think I can stop here.